Okay, so welcome back to the Muscombe History Group. Another of our lockdown programs, and this one's a continuation, coaching on the Great North Road. And this is part 2, where we'll be covering the journey from London through to York. So, all aboard and let's away on our journey. We've said that a typical 4-horse team was a valuable asset to the mail coach, however, and all the houses used would be owned by the contracted operator, but the mail coach teams were usually run in matching pairs that were kept together to learn their routes and positions on the coach. Each horse would be fitted with its own made-to-measure harness, adjusted to fit exactly, thereby avoiding fatigue and injury to the horses. Add to this the general rule of thumb that each coach needed one horse for every mile of its journey, and the horse teams become a serious investment. For instance, on the route from London to Edinburgh, almost 400 horses will be needed, and that's 200 matched pairs. Stagecoaches left from various inns and hotels around London. The Swan with Two Necks, the Bull and Mouth, the Nelson, and usually these were owned by the coach operators. However, all mail coaches started from St Martin-le-Grand, the General Post Office, in the shadow of St Paul's Cheapside, and often crowds would gather to see these coaches set off early in the morning and late in the evening. So we'll be taking the Edinburgh coach, but only as far as York, the London to York run, going up what has now become the Great North Road. Firstly, we have to get clear of London. From St Martin's-le-Grand on Cheapside near St Paul's Church, we set off and joined the road going north. A king of the roads are the people who carry the Royal Mail as a regular business. By 1838, carrying the Royal Mails has become lucrative and a very competitive business. Many operators were forced out of business by more efficient competition. But William James Chaplin, 1787 to 1859, is a real king of the roads. He was a stagecoach proprietor who developed a large coaching business before the arrival of the railways. By 1838, he has more than 80 coaches and 1,800 horses on the roads of Britain almost every 24 hours. He also owns several hotels and taverns, giving him an estimated annual turnover of about £500,000 a year. This in 1838. So who is this Bill Gates guy anyway? So Chaplin owns the Swan with Two Necks in Lad Lane, and this does start a Royal Mail run for Bath by the Beckenham Inn. It leaves at 7:30 p.m. and arrives in Bath at 9:30 the following morning. It then leaves at 5:30 p.m. to get back into London by 8 a.m. the next day. His coach, the Royal Volunteer, travels from Bath to Bristol through Chippenham daily. The coach will be gently hauling around the side streets to get onto the main road to head north. Even at this time, the roads are quite busy with wagons and gigs and post-chaise, so the guard is briskly trumpeting clear the way on his horn. The driver might even have to manoeuvre his team past one of the newfangled omnibuses, drawn briskly by a team of 3 horse in unicorn formation, a pair with one in front. The roads out of the city are busy, with tradesmen going about their business and businessmen going to their offices. But even when we hit the open road, we will not be on our own. 2 other coaches will travel the same roads and accompany us at least for the first part of our respective journeys. The London to York and on to Edinburgh coach leads the trio, and this coach travels up the west side of Lincolnshire to service its border towns. But the Louth coach, following a few minutes behind, gets well into Lincoln County and visits Lincoln City. And then comes the London to Glasgow coach, which brings up the rear of the trio. Soon the horses are gently trotting into Shoreditch, where the real stage journey begins. All the journeys to the northern towns take their measurement for the first fair stage from Shoreditch Parish Church. As the coach passes through the village, it also passes the post office. It's still early, so the postmaster, still in night attire, leans out of his bedroom window to exchange mailbags with the guard, although the suggestion in this picture is that it's done rather like the British Railways post office grabbing a net. I think probably the coach would actually have to stop for this exchange to take place. Not every town and village will have a post office so conveniently appointed, but every post office will hand in and receive mail. This is still something of a novelty, post every day. So most of the post offices become a hive of social activity as the locals collect their mail, pass the time of day with friends and neighbours, and discuss the latest news. And perhaps they think about how to reply to the post they have just received. The post office has begun to take over from the village pump as the place for news and exchanging local gossip, and where local matters can also be settled. The road through Shoreditch is getting busy, and the guard is continually tooting his horn to sound clear the road. And a couple of times he has to sound the call "ware near side" to alert the driver of careless costermongers who push their barrows into the side of the coach as they try to persuade the passengers to buy a snack for the journey. This is Shoreditch Rookeries, not the best part of town. But soon the grime and filth gives way to a much more open and pleasant surrounding, with a nicely tamped and bedded earthen road, liberally strewn with straw to handle the animal waste, and smooth enough and hard enough to evidence excellent road maintenance by the local council. This is Kingsland Road, Shoreditch, and part way along we make our first stop at the Cherry Tree to pick up a couple of passengers who did not want to fight their way into the early morning London so early in the morning to catch the coach. Apparently they're both going right through to Edinburgh to do some business with a whisky distillery. Let's take a closer look at the economics. The fare to Edinburgh one way is £14, 11 shillings and 4 pence. With accommodation and other extras, let's say there's not much left out of £20 for the one-way journey. If the return trip is about the same, we have a total expenditure of £40 for each person for each trip. But this is at a time when the average employee will be lucky to be earning more than £120 per year. On the other hand, transport costs of private hire post-chaise with 2 postilion riders and guides would, for the same journey, be at least £35 plus expenses. At this time, the average labourer's full-time wage for a 60-hour week would be about £30 a month, £360 per annum. Such men as these have serviced and cleaned our coach at Veedler's Yard in Millbank since its last run. They will have oiled the leathers, greased the axles, tattles and moving parts, checked the springs for damage and tested the brakes. The next small town on the route is Stoke Newington. The town sprawls out from its high street and is home to between 3,000 and 4,000 people at this time. If the coach stops at all, it is a very quick stop to exchange mails with the postmaster, and then on at an extended trot to Stamford Hill. We are now off the paved roads of London and onto the limestone gravels and lush turfs of the Chilterns. The trip is much quieter and the coach is starting to boat sway, a fore and aft swaying that encourages sleep among the passengers. Today, Stamford Hill is taken fairly easily, all the passengers staying in the coach and the horses blowing only a little as they crest the top. Even so, the guard has stepped down from his box to walk beside the coach and loosen his stiffened muscles. In winter, the story is very different, with at least the male passengers climbing the hill on foot and maybe even having to push the coach onwards in the slippery and slimy chalk. Looking backwards from the crest of Stamford Hill gives us a last view of London, with the dome of St. Paul's marking our starting point, whilst looking forward gives us a pleasant view of the English countryside. This area has some palatial houses and parks. This is where the city men of business and merchants live, with their privileged families, beautiful views and a sense of being above it all, but still convenient for London. Soon the horses are easing downhill and trotting towards Tottenham. The guard startles the outside passengers as he loudly blew the post horn call. It is followed by "Clear the road" to warn the toll keeper ahead that the York coach is on its way and to open his gates. As usual, the old soldier manning this gate has opened it in good time and is there to knuckle his forehead in smart salute as the horses pass through at a control canter. We talked in part 1 about the basis of toll charges. Shown is an original list of the tolls on the Upton Turnpike. Note the all-encompassing list of liabilities to the tolls. And also note that the width of the tyre or rim makes a difference to the toll charges. Trotting briskly through Tottenham village, we pass the new High Cross, which was raised by Dean Wood. And then it's on to the Bell at Edmonton, which you might remember as a destination of John Gilpin, his wife, his children 3, his sister-in-law and his nephew. But it was Dick Turpin who made a more famous ride down Edmonton High Street, leaping over a cart that was drawn across the street to block his way and carrying on up to the north. Our coach is now well into the countryside, but on a modern map we haven't got clear of Greater London. The modern border of London is the M25 motorway ring. We cross this future boundary as we drive into Waltham Cross, but we've only just reached Edmonton, which is inside the M25 ring. At 18 minutes past 9, exactly on time, we trot into Waltham Cross for our first stop to change horses. Postal exchanges are a little more complex here. Since 1836, Waltham has been a cross post, exchanging packages between the York coast and the Holyhead coach, which passes here on its way from Barnet. This, as well as general mails to and from London and Waltham. Just in time for a late breakfast for those who are not commonly up with the lark, a quick bumper of the local porter, and a much needed visit to the clothes closet, and we're on our way again towards Huntington. Until the 1700s, Waltham Cross was more popularly called Eleanor's Cross, noting one of the 12 funereal crosses raised by Edward I to remember the overnight rest of his dead queen from Harby near Lincoln to Westminster Abbey. Puckeridge is a tiny hamlet of some 40 souls that somehow has managed to get a post office. It's too small to justify a stop, so if there is some mail, the guard drops it into the stump of a hollow tree. Mail is picked up when the postmaster gently throws a satchel up to the guard, and if the guard misses it, the mail has to wait until the next day. The road now follows the River Lee, and on through the narrow streets of Cheshunt, past Broxbourne, Hoddesdon, and down to the Saracen's Head at Ware, which was famous for its great bed that can now be seen in the South Kensington Museum. A change of horses at Buntingford, then on to the Red Lion at Royston, to arrive at exactly 4 minutes past 12. At this time, the Louth coach is 2 miles behind and closing fast, and the Glasgow coach is already on the Great North Road at Baldock. Among the best known of the coachmen is Lord St. Vincent Cotton. A true baronet, he drove the Brighton coach for a wage of £300 a year. To this he added generous gratuities, winnings from bets, and gifts for services rendered. These might be to allow a young aristocrat lad to take the ribbons for a stage, or accompanying an older aristocratic lady to a theatre show, or an intimate meal in some hostelry. It's sometimes said that he even managed to replace the £5,000 left him by his father and gambled away in 3 years. This is, however, unlikely. Quite a few mature and frustrated sons of landed gentry, whose legacy had gone to the older sibling, had taken up the professional role of sitting on the box as a Royal Mail coachman. And many young graduates from the best universities of England and the continent took up a semi-professional hold on the ribbons for a year or two. Many preferred to gain a reputation for acts of real skill rather than reckless feats of speed. Some became real experts with the whip. It is said that Robert Nelson could remove a fly from one of the leader's ear without disturbing the horse's trot. We passed through the town of Manchester, where the Roman roads of Ermine Street and the Via Davina cross. Then we ourselves crossed the Great Ouse by the magnificent medieval bridge to enter Huntingdon, the county town of Huntingdonshire. Huntingdon's bridge is the only dry crossing of the Ouse for several miles in each direction. The first part of our journey is on the eastern loop of the Great North Road through Tottenham, Waltham Cross and Ware. Strictly speaking, this is not the Great North Road as we know it today. It is the old Northern Road. Until the route reaches Baldock, we are favouring the modern A10 rather than the A1. But from Baldock it runs on the present Great North Road to Huntingdon, which again the modern A1 manages to bypass. Huntingdon is the birthplace of Oliver Cromwell, and the coach will pass his birthplace on its way to the George Hotel. Besides being the birthplace of Cromwell, Huntingdon was the home of the famous diarist Samuel Pepys, who attended school here. We exchange horses at the George Inn, which still exists and has retained one of its coaching galleries. It's believed that the George was owned by Oliver Cromwell's grandfather. The Daily Mail leaves Huntingdon at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon. We have an unscheduled but expected delay before reaching the Lincolnshire town of Stamford. This stretch of the journey will actually take us from the George Hotel at Huntingdon to the George Hotel at Stamford and on to the George Hotel at Grantham. At this time, about 1 in 4 of the hostelries between London and Edinburgh were called the George. The coach timetable runs to the minute, but 15 minutes are lost in the timetable to allow an unusual shopping stop at the village of Stilton. It is here that innkeeper Mr. Cooper Thornhill proudly and uniquely sells Mrs. Paulette's now world-famous cheese that she makes in Wymondham near Melton Mowbray. Stilton cheese. It sells for £0.50 a pound. That's 2 6 in old money per pound in old weights. Or if you prefer, it's half a kilo for 12.5 pence. You couldn't get it for that price now. Stilton cheese was highly prized in the gentlemen's clubs and the better class London houses and hostelries. Stilton cheese has never been made at Stilton, but Cooper Thornhill kept a secret stock in a dry well, and noble houses and fashionable eating places would actually send their staff on the stagecoach to Stilton and back to obtain a cheese or two, so the name of the shopping stopover stuck for the cheese. The coachman and the guard on the up coach would periodically take 5 or 6 cheeses as sales commission and sell them in London at a healthy profit. A mile beyond Stilton we reach the turning at Norman Cross. It's here that the Louth Mail turns towards Peterborough and then moves on into the Lincolnshire towns. It's also here that we find an interesting column with an eagle on top. I used to pass this lots of times when I was driving up and down the A1, and always assumed that it was something to do with commemorating the 8th Air Force, the United States Air Force, which had bases all around this area. Except one day I stopped to have a look at what it was, and was surprised to discover it was actually commemorating the site of a vast French prisoner of war camp of the Napoleonic War era. The post office actually offered rewards to their guards who recaptured or shot an escaped prisoner. I can imagine many baffled Frenchmen or Bedfordshire farmers, arrêtez-y ou je vais tirer. Hein? Needless to say, the Peterborough Mail carried the headline, "Coach Guard Kills Innocent Farmer." This created quite a furore, and the post office decided to withdraw its offer of reward. However, the guard case was dismissed. He was, it was said, doing his duty. We then pick up fresh horses at the Haycock Inn at Wansford. Wansford is unusual because the River Nene flows through the village centre, and south of the river is Bedfordshire, but north of the river is Lincolnshire, which is where we're heading next. So as we cross the bridge over the River Nene, we travel from Bedfordshire into Lincolnshire. So across the Nene we go and into Lincolnshire. Running into Lincolnshire, our coach first passes the elaborate wedding cake structure of Burghley House, the home of the badminton horse trials. Burghley House is the Elizabethan Hampton Court Palace. Hampton Court Palace was built by Cardinal Wolsey, who was Chancellor to Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth's father. Burghley House was built by Lord Burghley, who was Chancellor for Queen Elizabeth. As we pass Burghley House, we come onto an itinerary map for the period. Here's Burghley House, and it takes us over the next stage of our journey from Stamford along the Great North Road to the north of Tuxford. Surprisingly, this section of the road was not highly rated, being variously called a muddy back alley and a messy puddled lane. I'm sure the people of Stamford wouldn't agree with that, as the horses trot down under the gallows sign and cross into Stamford High Street for the George Hotel, where seasoned travellers prepare for a quick dash to the clothes closet or a snack stall. Stamford is an attractive and largely unspoilt town, built in the famous honey-coloured local Collyweston stone. But the passengers have no time to look around, as the changeover here is notoriously fast. On one recorded occasion, the Edinburgh Mail stopped for only 1.5 minutes to change horses and check passengers. Enough time to change the horses and hand the passengers a snack of the newfangled sandwiches, and then off on their way. The interior cabin is not large and can hold up to 6 people. Sometimes, with only 1 or 2 people in on a cold day, some other help is needed. Hot stones to put on the seats and on your back, perhaps a belly warmer filled with hot water, or a stone hot water bottle to put your feet onto, hand warmers to pop into your pocket, and sometimes on a full day you get taken short, but the coach isn't going to stop. Ladies have a decorum to keep up, and gentlemen use some other sort of implement. The coach won't stop, so it has to be done and ejected from the window. The Stamford that was missed. Going over the bridge in Stamford, you can look back towards the George Hotel up the main street and look forward towards the parish church. On the way out, the road goes past Scott's Gate, and perhaps the guard will regale the passengers with the story of Daniel Lambert, reputedly the heaviest man who has ever lived in England. Although a Leicester man, Lambert is buried in St. Martin's Church in Stamford. He was visiting Stamford for a day at the horse races. He died aged 39 at the Wagoners' Arms, and his tombstone records that his waist was 9 feet 4 inches around. Each leg was 3 feet 1 inch around, and he weighed 52 stones and 11 pounds. Needless to say, a Leicestershire man got buried in Stamford. It's here, as we leave Stamford, that the Glasgow coach turns back onto the old Northern Road. It will now travel through Oakham, Melton Mowbray, Kegworth, Uttoxeter, Stone, Newcastle-under-Lyme, Middlewich, Manchester, Lancaster, Carlisle, and then a long stretch over Shap to get to Dumfries, Kilmarnock, and on to Glasgow. In the meantime, our coach will go up the A1 to York and then on to Edinburgh. Leaving Stamford is a long uphill drag of streetway, where the horses have to pull hard into Rutlandshire. As they reached the Smith's Yard at Stretton, the sweating team was changed after a shorter than usual stint, and a new specialist team trots on towards Grantham. In this area the teams were well used to the road that they were travelling, so they needed very little driving. Grantham is a famously historical town associated with many historical figures. It was just outside of Grantham that Isaac Newton discovered the falling apple. He then stood on other men's shoulders to see the calculus and the laws of motion. King John also favoured Grantham, as did King Richard III, both of whom were in the habit of staying at the Knights Templars hostel free of charge. There's another famous lady from Grantham who apparently becomes Prime Minister, but that doesn't happen for another 100 years, so we don't know anything about her. It's quite possible that everything changes at Grantham, including the coach. Coaches need servicing every 200 miles or so, and our coach has done 100 miles coming up from London. The coach, horses and driver would all be changed at the coach operator's expense by the liverymen at York. The operators tried to keep their mail coaches in regular teams which had learned how to work together, and with their own made-to-measure harnesses they also knew their ground. But after a couple of 100 miles the coach would need a thorough servicing, so this one that we've travelled up from London on can go back to London to visit Wiedler's yard with the up trip. There for greasing, oiling, checking of worn springs and horse leather cleats, and generally cleaning and polishing. Meantime, the coachman walks quietly around the table of passengers, wishing each passenger a safe journey onwards, and reminding them that they have just travelled 106.5 miles in 11 hours and 26 minutes in perfect safety. He extends his right hand with the palm uppermost, either to shake hands with the ongoing passenger or to receive the gratuity of a couple of silver coins with suitable embarrassed surprise. Oh Lord, you shouldn't have. The guard is not allowed to accept gratuities, but he might have some sort of arrangement with the coachman. And then just as everyone sits down for their meal, the new coachman, Thomas Hennessy, introduces himself to the York passengers. Hennessy is a well-known coachman on the Great North Road and inspires confidence. In fact, individual coachmen have their own fans. Some travellers would delay their journey to wait for a particular driver to take them on the stage. Hennessy warns of departure in 5 minutes. A regular stunt by innkeepers and hostelries along the way was to wait serving food until 2 minutes before the coach was due to leave, and then the passengers went without eating, but the hostelry kept the money that they'd paid for their meal. We are now running on home ground, from Grantham through to Newark. First of all, we will have to tackle Hoocliffe Hill, and then beyond Newark we may have to tackle the famous northern floods. And as we travel through the northern floods, we'll be passing through South and North Muscombe. Turning out from the rear of the George Inn, the coach eases down a slight gradient, passing the Angel and Royal Hotel, and you can see the wheelers pulling back on their tongue reins to hold the coach steady. As a hostelry, the Angel and Royal Hotel had belonged to the Knights Templar, where they had entertained the kings and queens of England. The modern Angel and Royal is built behind the facade of the old Temple hostelry, which is still there today. Almost as soon as we leave the habitation of Grantham, we begin a steady climb that in gentle grades and then steeper steps will take us the 360 feet above the town onto Gonavy Moor. The pace is slow, but the horses usually cope, and then the coach crosses Gonavy Moor with daytime views along the Vale of Belvoir to the castle, or in the other direction, views to Lincoln Cathedral. At Great Gonavy, the coachman stops the coach at the recruiting sergeant's inn with a shout of 2 minutes only, and he and the guard jump down. This stop is not to change horses, but to prepare the coach and warn the passengers of a coming steep hill. Coachmen were often judged by their ability to control the speed of the coach. Firstly, by controlling the wheelers to hold back the coach, then by using the brakes to slow the coach without tiring the horses, literally brakemanship. But on really steep hills, it needed one or more skids or shoes or ploughs to be fitted under the rear wheels, and a roller bar when going uphill to stop the coach rolling backwards. Even in good weather, the descent of Hoocliffe Hill was difficult, with the wheeler horses pulling hard against their steering chains and the leaders holding back on their haunches even though they have no braking power whatsoever. In winter, and particularly in the snow and ice, it becomes truly ferocious, with both the coach and horses slipping and straining, and the passengers usually choosing to walk until the coach is back onto level ground. Sometimes the iron skid and the wheel rim will become glowing red hot with the friction of slowing the descent. When this happened, the coachman would sometimes step down from his box and use nature's means to cool the skid down so that it could be removed safely. Even today, it is said that lorry drivers are entitled by law to use the rear wheels of their vehicles as a toilet. With the passengers calming down and the horses regaining their cool and poise, the coachman now sets the coach at a gentle trot along the easy ground to Foston, where a change of horses awaits at the Black Horse. The route then goes through the extended ribbon development of Long Bennington village. And passes on to see Dry Doddington Church in the distance, which has the unbelievably leaning Tower of Doddington. It's amazing that the Tower at Doddington leans as far as the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but it's nothing like as famous. Perhaps that's because it's nothing like as tall. Going through the toll gate, as we leave Lincolnshire and enter Nottinghamshire, we begin to run on the new turnpike that since 1767 has bypassed Balderton village centre, passing the Turk's Head public house on the corner of Balderton Main Street. After Hornton Lane, the road runs through open countryside along the London Road, with the spire of St Mary of Magdalene's Church beckoning our entry into Newark-on-Trent. Down the London Road to Balderton Gate, across the Dry Bridge and Barnby Gate, with the guard sounding clear the way on his post horn to warn the local carters, and into the marketplace with its impressive frontages and half-timbered buildings. The Royal Mail arrives in the Market Square in Newark at precisely 9:20 p.m. It's still an impressive view even today. But Newark-on-Trent can be very difficult for even the most skilled of coachmen, with crowded coachyards, narrow streets, market stalls, roadside booths, main road traffic crossing on the famous Fossway, local traffic meandering, and preoccupied pedestrians wandering. Ah, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Our journey takes a change of horses at the Clinton Arms at 9:24. The Clinton Arms has been variously called the Cardinal's Hat, the Talbot, and the Kingston Arms. In 1631, the Talbot Inn and the North Muscombe Manor were granted to the religious men of the parish of Newstead to support 2 priests. And during the 17th century, the infamous highwayman Swift Nicholas Nevinson, stayed at the Talbot and is believed to have shared his ill-gotten gains with the landlord. In the 1670s, Swift Nick was known and talked about all over the country. And passing through the Clinton Arms in 1835, we might even catch one of the young Mr. Gladstone's election speeches. He was Member of Parliament for Newark from 1832 to 1845. At the invitation of the Duke of Newcastle, he made the Clinton Arms his political headquarters from 1835 until 1845. We should spend a little more time with Swift Nick Nevinson. He rode with his gang up and down the Great North Road between Stamford and Tuxford, robbing rich and poor alike. But he never committed violence against his victims. The threat was usually sufficient. However, the flamboyant Nick would often excuse a lady from being robbed if she would dance with him there on the open road. His men were a little less sure about this practice, as they were literally risking their necks for Nick to enjoy a dance on the road instead of a dance at the end of a rope. It was Nick Nevinson who rode from London to York in record time. The Dick Turpin legend contains not a grain of truth in reality. Swift Nick Nevinson robbed a homeward bound sailor on a summer morning in 1676 on the road outside Gad's Hill in Kent. Why he was there is not known, but deciding he needed to establish an alibi, Nevinson sets off to ride from Gad's Hill to York, more than 190 miles away, which he covered in about 15 hours. That's an average of 13 miles per hour. He then laid a wager with the Lord Mayor of York about the outcome of a bowls match, and made sure his lordship noted the exact time on the summer's evening. When the law came to arrest him, the Lord Mayor solemnly witnessed he could not have been in Kent on the morning in question, and in York by the evening of the same day. He was acquitted. Unfortunately, Nick was captured again whilst holding up a coach and stealing the horses. He was tried and sentenced to transportation to Tangiers, where he will be sold as a slave worker for the Emir. This time, however, he escaped before the ship sailed from the Thames and swam to the shore. He went back to robbing coaches, but eventually he had to kill a man, and then he killed a law officer who came to arrest him. There was no way back from this, so when he was again arrested, he was sentenced to be hanged, and the sentence was carried out at York Castle on the 4th of May, 1684. No less a person than Daniel Defoe vouches for the truth of the ride from Kent to York. Not a grain of truth is in the Dick Turpin version of the tale, said Defoe. The route out goes in front of the town hall, across the front of the church, and down Kirkgate, with its echoes of Queen Henrietta and the Civil War. Across Castlegate, passing the old cattle market and the Castle Gatehouse, which is said to be the building where King John died, and out across the Newark Bridge. The York Mail crosses Newark Bridge at 9:35 p.m. and sets off on time at a fast canter across the island towards the main flow of the Trent and the Muscombe bridges. We are now officially entering the barbarian north. Where some southerners genuinely believe the weather gets much more violent, with sudden lightning storms to frighten the horses, not to speak of terrifying the passengers. Or terrible winter conditions that can occur even in July and August. However, on this stretch we might genuinely meet the first climatic hazard of the north. In the area where the Trent makes its major turn to the north, that leads to eventually the Humber and runs with the Great North Road for much of the way, this part of the route is prone to and often threatened by floods. Usually roads like this marked by pollarded willows, but the coachman and guard still have to judge the depth of water ahead and the danger of potholes covered by water. Remember, we're here at 9:35 in the evening. For much of the year, this part of the journey is done in darkness. And sometimes they have to assess the risks only by the light of coach lamps and the moon. From 1770, Smeaton's arches reduced the risk of the road flooding. But the Trent runs full and free in these parts, often swollen by rainwaters that have fallen in hills many miles away. And surprisingly, it still happens even today. The Great North Road between Newark and Sutton-on-Trent was always expected to be wet and mired. Sometimes floodwater might rise to the axles, and the horses would have to paddle and splash. Sometimes it might rise to the body, and the passengers would have to stand on their seats whilst the horses would try to swim, and the driver would have all his time cut out keeping their feet on the ground. Occasionally it would be too deep to cope with, and the stage would be delayed. But the mail still had to get through. Then the guard had little choice but to put the mails into a watertight oilskin, unhitch one of the leaders, and swim with the horse and the mail across the flood to the nearest dry land. Wet through and with no time to dry off, he would then mount the horse and ride on to the end of the stage, hoping he could make new arrangements there. If he was lucky, he would receive half a guinea from the postmaster for his commitment and determination. He could just as easily die in the attempt. But today the weather is set fair, and as we trundle across the island, we pass the humps and hollows and ditches that mark the places where the Scots rebuilt Edinburgh and other fortified bastions on the island to lay siege to Newark during the third siege of the First English Civil War. Indeed, it was only a mile upstream at Kelham where King Charles surrendered to the Scots, and he would have travelled up the road we now pass down in order to order Newark to surrender and end the first unpleasantness. We trot quickly past the Ashiana, also known as the Lord Nelson Inn, also known as the Elm Tree Inn, also known as the Muscombe Inn. The inn was never a post house and was not listed in the 1830 list of hostelries on the Great North Road. Then we go down the Great North Road as it exists in North Muscombe and pass the Grange Gatehouse. Passengers riding outside on the roof would see over the wall and see the Grange itself. And if God in his mercy is willing, this is the standard caveat for coach operators to avoid blame for late arrivals. So if God in his mercy is willing, God must be taking a special interest in the coaching timetable. We pass Sutton and Weston and move away from the flood plains of the Trent and gently climb towards Tuxford. Tuxford is hard work for the horse team, not only an awkward hill to climb onto the town from both directions, but often there was thick, slimy, slippery clay to negotiate. Most coaches would hitch a cock horse to add pulling power up to the marketplace, like a 4x4 tractor. The cock horse is pulling on different ground, and at any one time can help the team maintain its traction. And there's a record in Tuxford Museum of the Horse of 74 coaches passing through Tuxford in a single day, lying as it does on a crossroads from Lincoln to Sheffield and from Nottingham and the Great North Road. A 15-minute break at Tuxford and the coach continues its uncomfortable ride through the night, and as it moves off, most of the passengers are dozing and trying desperately to get to sleep. From Tuxford, the road takes us up through the Sherwood Forest and to the town of Bawtry. And from Bawtry, we will run down into Doncaster. As we run into the main square, with the town hall and the theatre, we might still see the theatre lights as the performance will just be coming to an end. But before running into the main square at Doncaster, We will pass Robin Hood's Well, but before it was moved to its present location. So it would still be a well to refresh travellers going through Barnsdale Forest, though our mail coach will not stop here. This area was also famously the stomping ground of Svein son of Sishka, a famous outlaw originally known as the Prince of Thieves, who once inhabited Wentbridge. A medieval chronicler speaks of an outlaw named Svein son of Sishka, who robbed Abbot Benedict of Selby and constantly prowled around Barnsdale, threatening those who passed that way. Shades of Robin Hood there. And in the heart of the Went Valley, near the city of Wakefield, we pass over Went Bridge. The next stage of the journey is almost 20 miles of difficult terrain across moorlands approaching the town of Tadcaster. This part of the journey will be at dead of night, but for those passengers who might still be awake, the guard might tell the story of the Battle of Towton, because the coach route runs right through the old battlefield. Fought on the 29th of March 1461 during the Wars of the Roses, it is thought to be the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. An estimated 50,000 soldiers fought for hours amidst a snowstorm and blizzard on Palm Sunday. After the battle, Edward IV had gained the crown from Henry VI and driven the Lancastrians out of office in favour of his House of York. And now the trip takes us down to Tadcaster. We can probably smell Tadcaster in the night air long before we drive into the town. Tadcaster is the home of John Smith, the brewery, and it is the second most important brewery town in England after Burton-on-Trent. With a change of horses at the Old Brewery Inn, we are ready for the final stage of our journey. And finally, we reach our destination of York, 192 miles from London. Surprisingly, York is the home of the hansom cab, and its main square still becomes a popular gathering place. So, thank you again, and safe home after your long journey. And Caitlin, this one was specially for you. Look after yourselves now. Goodbye.